Hey, this is Jason Clark here at South Dakota State University, and today we're going to be talking about soil fertility guidelines for sunflowers and the new updates that are coming. So let's get going. For fertilizer guidelines here in South Dakota, we're first of all going to start talking about nitrogen, since nitrogen is probably the most important fertilizer nutrient that we're going to add to sunflowers. We're going to start off by talking about nitrogen rate and sunflower yield and also oil content. So first of all, let's get into some data and see what we've seen here in South Dakota. So here we're going to have on our y-axis our sunflower yield, and on our x-axis our nitrogen rate plus soil test nitrogen down to 2 feet. And we're going to relate this to yield and see what we see. So we can see the general trend here is that as we increase in fertilizer rate plus soil test N, we tend to generally increase in nitrogen fertilization. So this wasn't always only seen here in South Dakota, but also up north in North Dakota. So on our y-axis again is our sunflower yield, but here we're going to look at nitrogen rate only and see what it's like if we only look at nitrogen rate regardless of its effect on sunflower yield. So here we can see that we generally tend to increase. However, if we look right here at our zero, we have a very wide range of yield. And that wide range goes all the way up as to not promote a lot of confidence in these results. We can see a general trend, however that general trend is fairly small. So what we're going to do is this is only look at nitrogen rate. What happens if we also look at soil test nitrogen values? So here in this graph we're going to have in our x-axis the nitrogen rate plus our soil test N down to 2 feet. And look at that relationship. And as we can see here, the scatter that we saw before is much lessened. We see more of an increase here and then a decrease. However, we still have a good amount of scatter among this plot. So let's try one more thing. So the next thing we're going to do to try and improve relationships between nitrogen fertilization and sunflower yield is we're going to normalize our yield. We're going to put all the sites that may have different yield potentials, different yield levels, we're going to put them on the same scale. And that's what our y-axis is on this graph, and then we're going to regress it against our total known available nitrogen and look at the results there. And here we see a much less scatter among the plots, a much better relationship. We see that increasing total N versus normalized average yield is a much improved, and that's what we kind of want to see. So generally we see if we increase our N rates and plus soil test N in the soil, we see an increase in sunflower yield up to around this 250 pound per acre level. And now again, if we look in western North Dakota, we're going to look at that same normalized yield against total soil N, and we're going to see a similar relationship, a much tighter relationship than we've seen in the previous graphs. So this shows that when we look at these graphs, we need to make sure we normalize the yield to compare across sites, but we also need to look at soil test N plus the nitrogen fertilizer rate we're putting on. That's because sunflowers are really good at getting down in the soil and scavenging nitrogen, not only in the tops of the soil, but also in the 3 and 4 foot depth as well. So from here, let's move on to the next section. So this section we're going to talk about, does more nitrogen always mean more yield or more oil? So if we go back to our previous graph and we look at our sunflower yield versus our nitrogen rate soil test N, we see a relationship that looks like this. We're slowly increasing with nitrogen fertilization plus soil test N. However, if we move this graph up to the top a little bit, and then on our new graph we look at this same site year information, but we look at sunflower oil content, we see a different relationship. We actually see that our oil content is decreasing as that N rate plus soil test N level starts to increase. And this was seen regardless of how much the site responded to nitrogen fertilization. So another factor to consider is lodging. How does more nitrogen affect lodging? So in this graph on our y-axis, we have our percent sunflower lodging, and on our x-axis we have our total available nitrogen. And this is a site in Belfield, North Dakota in their fertilizer studies for sunflower. And as you can see here, we see an increasing trend, an increasing relationship between total available N in the soil and lodging. Now if we look at another site in North Dakota in Bottineau in their studies, we see a similar response to nitrogen. As that nitrogen goes up, our percent chance of lodging also goes up, which is really important to consider with sunflowers, because if it lodges, it's really difficult to harvest with our combines. Next, we're going to look at nitrogen fertilization effect on sunflower rust ratings. This is another example that's coming from North Dakota's research as well. And here we have in our first column pounds per acre of nitrogen that was applied, and then a sunflower rust rating. We're going to see how those sunflower rust ratings change as we increase the nitrogen fertilization rate. And here we can see a general increase going from 0 to that 200 pound per acre of the higher rating, the more severe of the rust on the plant. So now what? What do we do with all this information? Well, if we remember, we look back, we generally saw an increased trend as far as yield goes with sunflower yield with increasing nitrogen availability in soil. However, our sunflower oil content decreased. We had a higher percent chance of lodging, and we had a higher disease susceptibility as we increased our nitrogen fertilization. So to account for all of these things and to minimize the chances and the potential negative effects of lodging and disease on our yields for sunflowers, we've capped the recommendation for fertilizers at 150 pounds of soil test N plus nitrogen fertilizers to help minimize the negative effects of increasing nitrogen fertilization rates, but also still maintaining our yields that we want to obtain. So the next thing we're going to look at is what does this look like actually in practice. So we're going to go to our nitrogen fertilizer recommendation for sunflowers, and that's this right here. And in our next video, we'll be talking more about this nitrogen recommendation system and going through an example of how we can implement it on your farm. As always, thank you for watching this video, and you can always follow us on social media as well as our ST State Soil Fertility YouTube site. We'll see you in our next video for part 2.